Hey there, I wanted to make a series of videos about what I like to call truth's intention, and kind of an illustration of the way to think about that in your mind is that of a tug of war, where you have one side pulling on something to one direction, and then there's another side pulling it in the opposite direction, so that they're in tension with one another. There's quite a few concepts in the Bible which are in tension with other concepts. In other words, they seem to be somewhat contradictory, and God has actually made them that way on purpose. And we're to sort of keep them pulling against each other. Probably the most famous example of that, and that's not a subject I'm going to try to tackle in a YouTube video, but is that of God's sovereignty in everything we do and man's free will. And the Bible affirms both, and so we teach both, and everybody sort of has different takes on how those two things can coexist at the same time. But one thing that's undeniable is they are truths in tension. They seem to be contradictory, and they seem to be pulling on each other. But the one that I want to talk about today is what is typically called the expatriate principle and the indigenous principle. And it's how we're to think of ourselves during our time of stay on earth, if I can borrow a phrase from Peter. But first I want to mention the expatriate principle real quick. This would come from, like, one of the classic passages is here in Hebrews 11, where, speaking of Abraham, it says that he obeyed when he called out to go to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. See how I use the word foreigner? And Abraham's looking for something it's temporal. I mean, it's a real city, but it's not something that was ever going to happen in his lifetime. So he's a foreigner here on earth. He's looking for something that God's going to do yet future. Skipping a couple of verses and picking it up in verse 13, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." So they're strangers, exiles, foreigners. The word homeland, that it says that they were seeking a homeland. They're seeking this city whose builder and maker is God. In the Greek language, that's the word patria, and that's where I get the term expatriate. Maybe if you've done much traveling, you might know what an expatriate is. An expatriate is a citizen of one place that's living in another place, and that's what we are. We're Paul says over in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven, and yet we're living here. So one of the concepts that should always sort of be pulling on our mind is that this isn't our home. This is not our home. We are strangers here. We are exiles here. We are foreigners here. We're wandering about on the earth. This is not our place. We're looking for a homeland. We're waiting for that city whose builder and maker is God. I already mentioned the Philippians passage. I'll just read something that Jesus said. This is from John chapter 15. Jesus says, "If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." And he goes on to say that a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. And the whole point is it's that in the world, but not of the world. In the world, not of the world. Other passages speak about how we're to be separate from the world. Just thought of this one, but over at the very end of 2 Corinthians 6, speaking of not being unequally yoked with unbelievers, it says, Therefore go out of their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me. So there's definitely a sense in which we are supposed to be citizens of another place and not citizens of the place that we reside in. We're supposed to be separate from them, which is what the very word holy means. And at the same time, now you can take that too far. At the same time, I want to read you a passage from 1 Corinthians 9. This is where we would get what is typically called the indigenous principle. Let's see, Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law." Not being outside the law of God, of course, but under the law of Christ, he says, "that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings." And so Paul is saying, we have to live here. That's where, of course, the indigenous principle, indigenous means within. We have to be citizens. I already said that our citizenship is not here, but we have to be citizens here. We have to interface with the fallen, sinful world in order to be able to save them. How about a look at one more? This is also in 1 Corinthians. I just thought of this one too. 1 Corinthians 5. The context of this is the context of this section is sexual immorality in the church and open, flagrant sin that somebody doesn't want to stop. And he says, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." Not at all meaning the sexually immoral people of the world, or the greedy, or the swindlers, or idolaters, since you'd have to go out of the world. He's saying, I told you not to associate with sexually immoral people, or greedy people, or swindlers, or whatever. Well, if you were going to apply that to the people of the world, well, you could never do anything. You could never shop anywhere. You could never go anywhere. We would have to set up, we would have to sort of set up a camp out in the desert and live in a compound if we were to do that. And who are we going to save doing that? No one. So he says, "But now I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or a swindler. Do not even eat with such a one. For what have you to do with judging outsiders? Is it not the person inside the church who you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you." So here we see both principles sort of working at the same time. We see this expatriate principle in the sense of this isn't our home, and we're to be separate, and we're to be different. And so those within the church who are claiming to be a brother and yet living in open, flagrant sexual sin and refuse to do anything about it, or even refuse to say that it's even wrong, we have to put them out. And yet at the same time, we see the indigenous principle at work here in that we have to interface with a sinful world. We're not going to save anybody. We're not going to be able to preach the gospel. We're not going to be able to plead with men to be reconciled to Christ, as 2 Corinthians 5 says, if we're not going to associate with any of those people. And so this is something where we have to keep these truths in tension. These things. The one will kind of pull you over here, and the one will kind of pull you over here. And if all we do is focus on the expatriate principle, we're going to end up sort of like being Essenes